The jungle breathes around Colonel Kiyono Ichiki as he kneels beside the muddy Tanaru River, studying the American positions through his field glasses. It's 2 a.m. on August 21st, 1942, and the humid Guadalcanal air clings to his uniform like a second skin. Behind him, 900 of Japan's most elite soldiers wait in perfect silence, veterans of China, Malaya, and the Philippines, men who have never tasted defeat. Ichiki adjusts his sword at his side, the familiar weight reassuring against his hip. For 6 months, the Americans have been running from Japanese steel across the Pacific. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, everywhere the rising sun appears, the Americans flee or surrender. These Marines on Guadalcanal will be no different. "Honorable Colonel," whispers his aide, Lieutenant Furukawa, crawling up beside him. "The men are ready. Henderson Field will be ours before dawn." Ichiki nods, watching the faint glow of cigarettes across the river, where American sentries smoke carelessly in their foxholes. Such indiscipline, such weakness. His lip curls in disgust. These are not the British soldiers we faced in Hong Kong, Furukawa-san. These are American weekend warriors, factory workers and farm boys playing at being soldiers. The sound of laughter drifts across the dark water from the Marine positions. Laughter. On the eve of battle, Ichiki has studied these Americans through intelligence reports. Soft civilians who enlisted after Pearl Harbor, barely 8 months of training between them, and the razor edge of Japanese Bushido. They'll break at the first banzai charge, just like the others. But something about this jungle feels different. The darkness seems deeper here, more alive. Strange birds call from the canopy above, and the very air feels heavy with menace. Ichiki shakes off the feeling. Battlefield nerves, nothing more. He's led troops across 3 campaigns without losing a single engagement. His fingers trace the ancient characters etched into his katana handle. Honor in death, victory in life. Words his grandfather carried through the Russo-Japanese War. Words that have never failed the Ichiki family. Tonight, they will carve a path through American flesh and restore Japanese honor to these cursed islands. "Signal the men," Ichiki commands, his voice barely audible above the jungle's whisper. "We attack in 1 hour. Tell them, no prisoners. These Americans must learn the price of defying the Emperor." As Furukawa crawls away to relay orders, Ichiki takes one last look through his field glasses. The American positions seem almost casual, too casual. Machine gun nests scattered seemingly at random, mortars positioned without apparent coordination. Either these Marines are complete amateurs, or... He pushes the thought away. There is no or. Japanese steel has never failed. Japanese courage has never wavered. These Americans are about to learn why the Empire of the Rising Sun has conquered half the Aegean Pacific. But as Ichiki settles back to wait for the attack signal, he cannot shake one disturbing question. Why aren't the Americans afraid? 6,000 miles away in Tokyo, the newspapers are already printing headlines about the coming victory. But here, in the suffocating darkness of Guadalcanal's jungle, Lieutenant Furukawa creeps between clusters of waiting soldiers, whispering final orders that taste like prayers. "Remember the code," he tells each group. "Death before dishonor. Victory or death. No retreat." The men nod silently, their faces painted with mud and determination. These aren't conscripts. They're the Ichiki detachment, handpicked from the elite 28th Infantry Regiment. Private Yamamoto clutches his rifle with hands that have never trembled in battle. Sergeant Tanaka runs his thumb along his bayonet edge, sharp enough to split silk. They are the sword of the Empire, and tonight they will cut deep. But across that narrow river, something unprecedented is happening in military history. Marine Sergeant Frank Few peers through the jungle darkness, his half-Cherokee blood singing with ancestral hunting instincts the Japanese cannot fathom. Beside him, Private Sid Phillips loads another belt of ammunition into his machine gun with the methodical precision of a farm boy who's spent his life fixing machinery that refuses to quit. You hear that? Few whispers to his foxhole partner. The jungle has gone quiet. Too quiet. Even the insects have stopped their nightly chorus. These aren't the weekend warriors Ichiki imagines. Phillips survived the Great Depression, watching his family lose everything, learning that sometimes you fight dirty or you don't eat. Few grew up hunting in Arizona mountains where one mistake means death, where patience and cunning matter more than courage. They're not fighting for emperor worship or ancestral honor. They're fighting to go home alive, and they're about to introduce the Japanese army to a kind of warfare that exists nowhere in their military manuals. Colonel Ichiki rises, his hand moving to his sword hilt in a gesture older than his grandfather's grandfather. Around him, 900 men prepare for what they believe will be the last banzai charge of a very short battle. They've practiced this moment 1,000 times. The swift river crossing, the coordinated assault, the terrified American retreat. But no one has told them that Marine Corps doctrine doesn't include retreating. Listen carefully, Ichiki addresses his battalion commanders in barely audible whispers. The American Marines are undisciplined individualists. They lack the spiritual strength of Japanese soldiers. When we charge with fixed bayonets, screaming the Emperor's name, their Western minds will break. They'll run like rabbits. His intelligence reports confirm everything he believes. These Americans come from a soft democracy where every man thinks he's special, where collective sacrifice is impossible. How can such men stand against soldiers raised on 2,000 years of samurai tradition? But across the water, machine gunner Art Pendleton is testing his weapon's traverse for the 100th time, calculating fields of fire with the cold precision of a Massachusetts factory worker who understands that machines either work perfectly or people die. His loader, Whitney Jacobs, arranges ammunition belts with obsessive care, because growing up poor taught him that wasting anything, even bullets, can get you killed. These Marines aren't thinking about emperors or democracy. They're thinking about the Japanese soldier who last week used a white flag to lure Colonel Goetge's patrol into an ambush, then beheaded the survivors and mutilated their bodies. They're thinking about Pearl Harbor, about friends who died in the Philippines, about a war they never wanted but now intend to finish. And they've spent weeks turning this river crossing into a killing ground. The Japanese military mind cannot comprehend what's waiting for them. Their Bushido code demands honor in battle, face-to-face combat where courage determines victory. But these Americans have no Bushido code. They have something more dangerous, the desperate ingenuity of men who refuse to lose. Hidden mortars are pre-sighted on the riverbank. Machine guns are positioned in interlocking fields of fire that will turn the water red. Flares wait to illuminate the killing ground. Even the barbed wire has been strung not to stop the Japanese, but to channel them into prepared killing zones. Private Jim Young adjusts his mortar sight one final time, remembering his father's words about hunting back in Ohio. Sometimes the deer thinks he's hunting you, son. That's when you find out who's really the predator. At 2:50 a.m., Colonel Ichiki gives the signal. 900 Japanese soldiers rise as one, their bayonets glinting in starlight, their voices joining in a war cry that has echoed across Asia for centuries. They surge toward the river with absolute confidence, certain that American nerve will shatter at the sound of Japanese steel. They have no idea they're about to encounter something their military philosophy never imagined. Americans who fight like the jungle itself, patient, brutal, and utterly without mercy. The first Japanese soldiers splash into the Tenaru River, and for just a moment, the night holds its breath. Then hell opens its mouth and swallows them whole. The first shot explodes from Marine Private Whitney Jacobs' rifle at exactly 2:51 a.m., shattering the tropical night like breaking glass. In that single muzzle flash, 2,000 years of Japanese military tradition collides with American firepower, and the collision destroys everything Colonel Ichiki thought he knew about warfare. Marine, tonight you die. The Japanese war cry splits the darkness as hundreds of elite soldiers plunge into the Tenaru River, their bayonets gleaming like silver lightning. They expect American panic, American retreat, American surrender. Instead, they get something that exists nowhere in their military manuals. They get Marines who fight like the jungle itself. Sergeant Art Pendleton's machine gun erupts first, its muzzle flash painting the riverbank in strobing orange light. Japanese soldiers, magnificent in their courage, perfect in their formation, charged directly into interlocking fields of fire that turn the shallow water into a slaughterhouse. Jesus Christ! Pendleton screams over the deafening roar of his gun. They just keep coming. But these aren't the scattered individual attacks Japanese doctrine expects from American individualists. This is coordinated violence on a scale that makes Bushido irrelevant. Every Marine weapon fires into predetermined killing zones. Mortar shells, pre-sighted days ago, begin falling with mathematical precision. Flares burst overhead, turning night into blazing day and silhouetting Japanese soldiers like targets in a shooting gallery. Colonel Ichiki watches in growing horror as his perfectly trained, perfectly disciplined soldiers are slaughtered not by American courage, but by American engineering. This isn't honor combat. This is industrial killing, and his men are the raw material. Private First Class Jim Young drops mortar shells down the tube as fast as his loader can hand them to him. Each explosion sends geysers of mud, water, and human flesh into the air. "We're not fighting soldiers," he shouts to his crew. "We're exterminating insects." The Japanese keep coming because Bushido demands it. Retreat is dishonor worse than death. But every step forward carries them deeper into a killing machine designed by men who learned warfare in the factories and farms of America. Men who understand that efficiency matters more than honor. Sergeant Frank Few, his Cherokee blood singing with predatory instincts, moves through the jungle like a ghost. When Japanese soldiers break through the river crossing, they find not retreating Americans, but individual Marines who hunt them in the darkness with techniques older than civilization. Few's knife finds 3 Japanese throats before they know death is among them. "This isn't war," gasps Lieutenant Furukawa, clutching a sucking chest wound as he watches his company disintegrate. "This is butchery." He's right. This is exactly what it is. The Americans fight without honor, without rules, without mercy. They use shotguns, weapons the Geneva Convention would later try to ban as too inhumane for warfare. They coordinate mortar fire like factory foremen coordinating assembly lines. They fight at night from concealment, using industrial violence against men trained for personal combat. And it's devastatingly effective. Colonel Ichiki, his perfect uniform now stained with mud and blood, realizes with crystalline horror that everything his military taught him is wrong. These Americans aren't fighting like soldiers. They're fighting like a machine. A killing machine that feeds on Japanese courage and excretes Japanese corpses. Private Al Schmid, his face half destroyed by grenade fragments, continues firing his machine gun even though he's been blinded. His loader shouts directions in his ear. "Left! Left! More left! Now fire!" The gun chatters endlessly, cutting down Japanese soldiers who die with perfect honor and perfect futility. "They're in the wire!" screams Corporal Johnny Rivers, watching Japanese soldiers tangle themselves in barbed wire that channels them directly into his gun's kill zone. His machine gun fires until the barrel glows red hot, until the water jacket boils, until the gun itself begins to melt from sustained fire. This is the moment when Japanese military philosophy meets American industrial capacity, and philosophy loses. The Japanese soldiers fight magnificently. They charge into machine gun fire without flinching. They leap over the bodies of their comrades and charge again. They scream the emperor's name as bullets tear them apart. Their courage is absolute, their discipline perfect, their honor unquestionable. And it means absolutely nothing, because the Americans aren't fighting for honor. They're fighting to win. And winning means killing every Japanese soldier in the most efficient way possible. Private Sid Phillips watches through his mortar sight as Japanese soldiers, boys his own age from farms and cities thousands of miles away, are blown apart by American explosives. He feels no honor, no glory, no satisfaction, just the grim determination of a farm boy who understands that sometimes you have to kill what's trying to kill you. The river runs red. Japanese bodies pile 3 and 4 deep in the shallow water. The sound of American weapons never stops. Machine guns, mortars, rifles, shotguns, all firing in a coordinated symphony of destruction that turns elite Japanese soldiers into scattered meat. At 4:17 a.m., Colonel Ichiki commits seppuku. He doesn't die in glorious combat with an American bayonet. He doesn't fall leading a final charge. He dies alone in the jungle, disemboweling himself with his ancestral sword because he cannot face the truth. That American cowardice has just destroyed the finest soldiers Japan could produce. His suicide note, found days later, contains a single line: "We did not understand what we were fighting." By dawn, 890 Japanese soldiers lie dead along a 100-yard stretch of riverbank. The Marines lose 43 men. The mathematical brutality of the casualty ratio tells the entire story. This isn't warfare as the Japanese understand it. This is extermination. Sergeant Few walks among the Japanese bodies as morning light filters through the jungle canopy. Many of the dead soldiers are younger than he is. Their uniforms are neat, their equipment perfect, their weapons clean. They died like heroes from a different century, killed by men from the next one. Private Phillips stares at a Japanese soldier who can't be more than 17, his hand still clutching a photograph of what must be his family. The boy's eyes are open, staring at nothing, and Phillips realizes with sick certainty that this is what modern warfare looks like. Not honor and glory, but efficient slaughter. "God help us," whispers Corporal Pendleton, surveying the carnage his machine gun has created. "What have we become?" The answer hangs in the humid morning air, unspoken but understood by every Marine who survived the night. They've become exactly what they needed to become. Not heroes, not warriors, not soldiers fighting for noble causes. They've become killers, efficient, remorseless, utterly effective killers. And in the jungle hell of Guadalcanal, that's the only thing that matters. The photographs tell the story better than any military report ever could. Japanese bodies stacked like cordwood along the Tanaru River. American Marines standing among the carnage, not celebrating, not smiling, just staring with the hollow eyes of men who've discovered something terrible about themselves. The mathematical precision of modern slaughter laid bare in black and white. Private Frank Pomeroy, who survived the battle, would carry one image for the rest of his life: a Japanese officer's sword still clutched in its owner's death grip, reflecting the morning sun like an accusation. "We fought like animals," he wrote to his sister back in Massachusetts. And the worst part is, it worked. That letter captures the psychological transformation that Guadalcanal forced on American fighting men. They went into the jungle as civilized soldiers following rules of honorable combat. They came out as something else entirely, Men who understood that winning matters more than honor, that survival trumps glory, that efficient killing beats courageous dying every single time. The Japanese military machine, built on 2,000 years of samurai tradition, never recovered from that realization. Within weeks, intelligence reports from other Pacific battles began reflecting a new reality. Japanese soldiers, who had charged American positions with suicidal courage since Pearl Harbor, now hesitated. They dug deeper foxholes. They fought more defensively. The terrifying confidence that had carried them across Asia began to crack. Because word spreads quickly in any army, the Americans weren't fighting like civilized soldiers anymore. They were fighting like the jungle itself, patient, brutal, and utterly without mercy. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, who commanded the Marines at what became known as Bloody Ridge, received a letter from a captured Japanese officer that perfectly summarized the psychological impact of American jungle tactics. Your soldiers fight without honor, but they fight to win. We can no longer count on your weakness. That sentence represents one of the most important strategic shifts in military history. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese commanders had to plan for American competence instead of American cowardice. They had to assume that Marines would fight to the last man instead of surrendering. They had to prepare for battles of attrition instead of quick victories, and Japan's entire Pacific strategy was built on quick victories. The ripple effects extended far beyond Guadalcanal. At Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Japanese defenders found themselves facing not the weekend warriors they expected, but professional killers who'd learned their trade in the jungles of the Solomons. Men who understood that war isn't about honor. It's about making the other guy die for his country. Marine Sergeant Sid Phillips, interviewed 50 years after the battle, put it simply. We went to Guadalcanal as boys playing soldier. We came back as men who knew how to kill efficiently. The Japanese never expected that transformation, and it cost them the war. But the cost extended beyond military strategy. The Marines who fought at Guadalcanal returned home carrying something dark and permanent in their souls. They discovered that civilized men could become savage killers when survival demanded it. They'd learned that courage without competence is just suicide, that honor without victory is just death. Most disturbing of all, they'd learned that they were very, very good at killing. Private Art Pendleton, whose machine gun had cut down hundreds of Japanese soldiers, never spoke about the battle to his children. When asked about his war service, he would only say, "We did what we had to do." His grandson found his war diary after Pendleton's death in 1987. The final entry, dated August 22, 1942, contains just 4 words, "God forgive us all." Today, military historians study Guadalcanal as the moment when American forces learned to match Japanese ferocity with industrial efficiency. But the real lesson runs deeper than tactics or strategy. Guadalcanal proved that civilization is a thin veneer, easily stripped away when survival is at stake. It demonstrated that ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, store clerks, can become extraordinarily effective killers when properly motivated. The Japanese soldiers who died at the Tenarú River were brave, disciplined, and honorable. They died for emperor and country with perfect courage. But courage isn't enough when your enemy has abandoned honor for efficiency, when your opponent fights not for glory, but for survival. In the end, that's the lesson written in Japanese blood along a jungle river on an obscure Pacific island. Sometimes the side that fights dirtiest is the side that goes home alive. And in 1942, going home alive was the only victory that mattered. The storm comes out of nowhere. March 31st, 1944. 2,000 feet above the Black Pacific, Admiral Manechi Koga grips the armrest of his seat as lightning splits the darkness around his Kawanishi flying boat. rain hammers against the aircraft's hull like machine gun fire. Through the small porthole, he can see nothing but churning ocean and jagged clouds illuminated by brief, violent flashes. But Koga isn't thinking about the storm. In his leather briefcase beside him lies a document that represents Japan's last desperate gamble, the Z Plan. Every page meticulously detailed, every strategic calculation verified by the finest naval minds in the empire. It's a plan so brilliant, so thoroughly considered, that American defeat seems inevitable. The Americans will come from the east, just as they always have. They'll throw themselves against Japan's fortress islands, Jaluit, Mila, Woche, Maloelap, those impregnable coral bastions bristling with guns and defended by thousands of determined soldiers. And when they do, when they bleed themselves white against Japan's prepared positions, the combined fleet will emerge from Truk like an avenging sword, destroying what remains of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one decisive battle. It's exactly what any rational military commander would do. Attack the obvious targets. Fight where the enemy expects you to fight. Koga adjusts his admiral's cap and stares into the storm. At 59, he carries the weight of an empire on his shoulders, the weight of following Yamamoto, the legendary architect of Pearl Harbor who had the fortune to die before tasting defeat. Now it falls to Koga to salvage victory from an increasingly desperate situation. "Admiral," his aide whispers over the engine noise, "the pilot says we may need to divert to—" "No diversions," Koga cuts him off. His voice carries the authority of a man who has spent his entire life preparing for this moment. "We proceed to Davao as planned. The fleet is waiting." What Koga doesn't know, what he cannot know as his aircraft fights through the storm toward what will become his watery grave, is that 600 miles away, American codebreakers are reading his most secret communications. Filipino guerrillas have already recovered the Z Plan from a crashed aircraft, and U.S. intelligence officers are studying every detail of Japan's perfect strategy. But even more shocking than this intelligence coup is what the Americans are actually planning to do with it. They're going to ignore it completely. You see, while Admiral Koga sits in his doomed aircraft, confident that he understands exactly how the Americans think, how they fight, how they must inevitably attack his fortress perimeter, the U.S. Pacific Fleet is preparing to do something that will shatter not just Japanese defenses, but the entire Japanese understanding of modern warfare. The Americans are about to prove that the most devastating weapon in war isn't superior firepower or better fortifications. It's the ability to make your enemy's entire strategic framework completely irrelevant. But how could the most brilliant naval minds in Japan be so catastrophically wrong about American intentions? To understand the magnitude of what's about to unfold, you have to step into the shoes of Rear Admiral Manzo Akiyama as he stands on the wooden dock at Kwajalein Atoll, January 15th, 1944. The morning sun reflects off the lagoon's crystal-clear water, and in the distance, he can see the concrete bunkers and gun emplacements that represent months of backbreaking construction work. Akiyama commands the 6th Base Force, the nerve center of Japanese operations in the Marshall Islands. From his headquarters on Kwajalein, he coordinates the defense of an island chain that stretches across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. It's a responsibility that weighs heavily on him, especially now that everyone knows the Americans are coming. But Akiyama isn't worried about Kwajalein. Why would he be? Look at the strategic situation through Japanese eyes in early 1944. The Americans have been following a predictable pattern since Guadalcanal. They attack the obvious targets, the outlying positions, grinding forward step by bloody step. They took Tarawa with massive casualties. They'll do the same thing here in the Marshalls, throwing themselves against the heavily fortified outer islands where Japan is strongest. The American mind is methodical. Akiyama tells his staff officers during their morning briefing. They will attack Yaluit or Mila first. Perhaps Wocha. They lack the imagination for anything else. His confidence isn't arrogance. It's based on solid intelligence and decades of military experience. The outer Marshall Islands bristle with defensive positions. Jaluit alone has over 3,500 troops and massive coastal guns. Mila boasts 2,530 soldiers and some of the finest fortifications in the Pacific. These islands form an impenetrable barrier that any rational enemy must neutralize before advancing deeper into Japanese-held territory. That's how warfare works. That's how it has always worked. Meanwhile, when 1,500 miles away at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz stares at aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across his conference table. His intelligence officers have just delivered a briefing that would seem impossible to Japanese strategists. They're going to bypass every major fortress island and strike directly at the heart of the Marshall Island chain. "Gentlemen," Nimitz says, his finger tracing a line across the map that skips over Jaluit, Mila, and Wachi entirely, "we're going straight to Kwajalein." The silence in the room is deafening. Even American officers find the plan audacious beyond belief. Kwajalein isn't just behind Japanese lines. It's the administrative center of the entire Marshall Island Defense Network. It's like attacking the enemy's brain while leaving his fists untouched. But that's exactly the point. American intelligence has discovered something the Japanese don't expect them to know. Kwajalein is actually the weakest link in the chain. While the outer islands are fortified to the teeth, Kwajalein has only about 1,120 combat-effective troops. The rest of its 5,000-man garrison consists of Korean laborers, construction workers, and support personnel who have never held a rifle in anger. Back on Kwajalein, Akiyama faces problems he doesn't even fully understand yet. His recent diary entries, recovered after the battle, reveal a man increasingly anxious about American reconnaissance flights that don't seem to follow any logical pattern. "The enemy aircraft photograph areas that make no strategic sense," he writes on January 20th. "Why do they repeatedly overfly our lagoon approaches when our main defenses face the ocean? Their intelligence must be faulty." But Akiyama's confusion runs deeper than tactical puzzlement. Like every Japanese officer, he's been trained in a military tradition that emphasizes decisive battle, honor in direct confrontation, and the spiritual superiority that comes from accepting the strongest enemy challenge. The idea that an enemy might simply avoid your strengths doesn't compute. It's not just unfamiliar, it's almost insulting. Consider the Japanese mindset in early 1944. This is a military culture that produced the samurai, that reveres death before dishonor, that sees strategic retreat as cowardice. When Admiral Koga designed the Z Plan, he wasn't just creating a military strategy. He was expressing fundamental Japanese beliefs about how honorable warriors should conduct themselves. You meet your enemy's strength against strength. You fight where the fighting is hardest. You prove your superiority through superior courage, superior discipline, superior willingness to die for your cause. The Americans, the Japanese believe, will have to fight this way too, because that's how real war is conducted. But what if the Americans don't share these beliefs? What if they see war not as a test of spiritual strength, but as a problem to be solved as efficiently as possible? What if they're willing to win ugly, to bypass honor for effectiveness, to let enemy fortresses wither on the vine while striking where the enemy is weakest? On January 29th, 1944, American carrier aircraft begin the preliminary bombardment of Japanese positions throughout the Marshall Islands. But instead of concentrating on the outer fortress islands as expected, they hit targets scattered across the entire chain. Akiyama watches from his command bunker as explosions bloom across distant atolls. They're softening up everything. his communications officer reports. Jaluit, Mile, Voce, Majuro. And sir, they're hitting us here too. Akiyama nods grimly. Finally, the Americans are showing their hand. This widespread bombing campaign confirms Japanese expectations. The Americans are preparing for systematic assault on multiple fortress positions. It will be costly for them, but at least it makes strategic sense. What Akiyama doesn't realize is that he's watching the most sophisticated deception operation in naval history. The Americans aren't softening up targets for invasion. They're hiding their true intentions behind a smokescreen of universal destruction. The real blow is coming tomorrow, and when it falls, it will change everything. January 31st, 1944, 5:47 a.m. The first explosions shatter the pre-dawn silence over Kwajalein Atoll like the end of the world. Admiral Akiyama bolts upright in his bunk as his entire command bunker shakes. Concrete dust rains from the ceiling. Outside, the thunder of naval gunfire rolls across the lagoon in continuous, devastating waves. Through the narrow observation slit in his bunker wall, he can see muzzle flashes lighting up the horizon like deadly stars. But something's wrong with this picture. Terribly, impossibly wrong. Sir, his aide burst through the bunker door, helmet askew, eyes wide with shock. The American fleet, they're not where they're supposed to be. Akiyama grabs his binoculars and rushes to the observation post. What he sees through the magnified lenses defies everything he thought he knew about warfare, about Americans, about the fundamental nature of military strategy itself. The U.S. Pacific Fleet isn't attacking Jaluit. It isn't pounding the massive fortifications at Mile or Wocha. Instead, 8 American battleships are sitting in the Kwajalein Lagoon inside his defensive perimeter, methodically destroying everything in sight with the precision of industrial machinery. How did they get past our outer defenses? Akiyama whispers, his voice barely audible over the bombardment. The answer is as simple as it is revolutionary. They didn't go past the outer defenses. They went around them. While Japanese commanders spent months preparing for frontal assaults on their fortress islands, the Americans developed something entirely new, a strategy so audacious that it didn't even exist in Japanese military thinking. They called it island hopping, but that bland term completely fails to capture the psychological devastation it's about to unleash. The USS New Mexico opens fire with her 14-inch guns, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile. The first salvo brackets the main command bunker. The second finds its range. Akiyama watches in horrified fascination as his carefully constructed defensive positions simply cease to exist under the methodical American bombardment. But the naval gunfire is just the opening act. At 6:15 a.m., the sky fills with the drone of aircraft engines, not the handful of planes that might support a traditional amphibious assault, but wave after wave of carrier aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, more aircraft than Akiyama has ever seen in his life. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nabata, stationed at the airfield, records in his diary what happens next. The enemy planes came out of the sun like a plague of locusts. Our fighters tried to respond, but they were outnumbered 20-1. I watched zero after zero fall, burning into the lagoon until there were no more zeros left to fall. By 7 a.m., 92 of the 110 Japanese aircraft in the Marshall Islands have been destroyed. The remainder flee to distant bases, leaving the island garrisons completely defenseless against air attack. This is the moment when Japanese strategic thinking doesn't just fail, it shatters completely. You have to understand, every Japanese plan for defending the Marshall Islands was based on the assumption that Americans would fight like Japanese. They would attack the strongest points first, seeking decisive battle, accepting massive casualties for the honor of direct confrontation. The outer fortress islands were supposed to attract American attention, to draw them into the grinding attritional warfare where Japanese spiritual superiority could triumph over American material advantages. Instead, the Americans treated Japanese fortress islands like obstacles to be avoided rather than challenges to be met. They left 11,000 Japanese troops on the outer islands to wither on the vine, starving, cut off from supplies, militarily irrelevant, while striking at the one point where Japanese defenses were thinnest. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders is immediate and devastating. Colonel Tarokichi Aso, commanding the 729 men of the Wache detachment who had just arrived on Kwajalein for transfer, stares at the American fleet through his field glasses. "This is not warfare," he mutters to his aide. "This is something else entirely." What Aso is witnessing is the birth of modern asymmetric warfare. The idea that victory comes not from defeating the enemy's strength, but from making his strength irrelevant. At 9:30 a.m., the first American landing craft hit the beaches. Major General Charles Corlitt's 7th Infantry Division doesn't charge into withering defensive fire like the Marines did at Tarawa. Instead, they wade ashore on beaches that have been so thoroughly pulverized by naval gunfire that one British observer later wrote, "Nothing could have lived through that sea and air bombardment. The beach was a mass of highly colored fish that had been thrown up there by nearby explosions." The prepared Japanese defenses, the gun positions, the concrete bunkers, the carefully sited machine gun nests, have been reduced to rubble and smoking craters. Most of the Korean laborers and support personnel surrender immediately, having never expected to fight a battle at all. But it's not just the physical destruction that breaks Japanese resistance. It's the complete psychological disorientation of fighting an enemy who refuses to follow the rules. Akiyama retreats to his final command bunker, trying desperately to coordinate a defense against an attack that shouldn't be happening. His radio crackles with confused reports from his surviving units. "Sir, the Americans have landed at 3 different points simultaneously. They're using some kind of amphibious tanks. We've never seen anything like them. Our coastal guns can't depress low enough to hit their landing craft in the lagoon. Every defensive plan, every carefully prepared position, every tactical doctrine developed over decades of military training has become useless overnight. The Americans aren't just winning. They're winning so easily that Japanese resistance collapses into bewildered chaos. By noon, American forces have advanced halfway across Kwajalein Island. By evening, organized Japanese resistance has effectively ended. In less than 18 hours, the administrative center of Japanese power in the Marshall Islands has fallen to an enemy attack that Japanese strategic doctrine insisted was impossible. The numbers tell their own devastating story. Out of 5,000 Japanese on Kwajalein, only 265 survive as prisoners. American casualties number just 177 killed and 1,000 wounded. It's not a battle. It's a systematic demolition carried out with industrial efficiency. But perhaps the most shocking moment comes when Akiyama, wounded and trapped in his final bunker, realizes that the Americans aren't even planning to attack the fortress islands at all. Radio intercepts reveal that Jaluit, Mila, and Vocha, the supposedly critical defensive positions that absorbed so much Japanese effort and resources, are simply being bypassed. 11,000 Japanese soldiers will spend the rest of the war sitting on heavily fortified islands that no longer matter to anyone. As American soldiers finally breach his command bunker, Akiyama experiences something no Japanese officer had ever been trained to process: the complete irrelevance of everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Americans hadn't just defeated Japanese defenses, they had made Japanese defenses meaningless. standing in the smoking ruins of his command post, surrounded by American soldiers who look more like factory workers than samurai warriors, Akiyama understands with crystal clarity that this is not just a tactical defeat. It's the end of an entire way of thinking about war, honor, and the nature of military conflict itself. The age of fortress warfare, of meeting strength with strength, of proving superiority through direct confrontation, dies with him in that bunker on Kwajalein Atoll. What's being born in its place will reshape not just the Pacific War, but the entire future of global conflict. The silence in Admiral Soemu Toyoda's office in Tokyo is deafening. It's February 8, 1944, 1 week after the fall of Kwajalein, and Toyoda, newly appointed to replace the deceased Admiral Koga, stares at intelligence reports that read, like science fiction, "The Americans have captured the heart of the Marshall Island Defense Network in 4 days. 11,000 Japanese troops remain stranded on outer islands that the Americans simply ignored. The entire strategic framework of Japanese Pacific defense has collapsed like a house of cards." How? Toyoda asks his intelligence officer. How did we miss this completely? The answer sits in a manila folder on his desk, the captured Z-plan that Filipino guerrillas had fished from a crashed aircraft months earlier. Every Japanese defensive position, every strategic assumption, every tactical doctrine had been laid bare to American intelligence. But even more devastating than this intelligence failure was the deeper psychological blindness it revealed. Japanese military thinking had become trapped in its own cultural assumptions. The belief that honor required meeting enemy strength directly. The conviction that Americans would fight like Japanese, seeking decisive battle where defenses were strongest. The inability to conceive that an enemy might simply walk away from your strengths to strike at your weaknesses. For surviving Japanese commanders like Toyoda, the shock was transformational and permanent. Post-war interrogations reveal officers who described feeling like they had been fighting ghosts, an enemy that refused to behave predictably, that treated war as an engineering problem rather than a test of spiritual strength. Lieutenant Commander Nabata, one of the few survivors from Kwajalein's airfield, later wrote, "We spent months preparing for the wrong war. While we built fortresses, they built flexibility. While we concentrated forces, they concentrated intelligence. While we prepared for battle, they prepared to avoid battle entirely." The psychological impact rippled throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Field commanders began second-guessing every defensive plan. Was this position too obvious? Would the Americans simply bypass it? How do you defend against an enemy that refuses to attack your defenses? But the Americans weren't finished revolutionizing warfare. What happened in the Marshalls was just the beginning. Over the following months, U.S. forces would leapfrog across the Pacific with devastating efficiency. The Mariana Islands fell in summer 1944, bringing B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. The Philippines were reconquered through a combination of amphibious assaults and brilliant tactical bypassing of Japanese strongpoints. Each victory validated the new American way of war. Strike where the enemy is weakest, make his strengths irrelevant, win through superior intelligence and operational flexibility rather than superior courage. The human cost of Japanese strategic miscalculation was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves marooned on bypassed islands, slowly starving while the war moved past them. They had been prepared to die gloriously in battle. Instead, they died slowly and pointlessly, victims of a strategic doctrine that had been rendered obsolete overnight. Today, military strategists study the Marshall Islands campaign as the birth of modern asymmetric warfare. The principles pioneered by American forces in 1944, avoid enemy strengths exploit intelligence advantages, prioritize operational speed over tactical perfectionism, became the foundation for everything from Cold War proxy conflicts to contemporary counterterrorism operations. But perhaps the most important lesson is psychological rather than tactical. The Japanese commanders who were so shocked by American island hopping weren't stupid or incompetent. They were trapped by their own cultural assumptions about how wars should be fought, how enemies should behave, how honor and effectiveness should balance against each other. In boardrooms and military academies around the world, the story of Japanese strategic blindness has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption-based planning. How many businesses have failed by assuming competitors would follow traditional patterns? How many military campaigns have crumbled when enemies refused to fight the expected battle? The storm that claimed Admiral Koga's life on March 31st, 1944, was more than just a meteorological accident. It was symbolic of the tempest that American strategic innovation was about to unleash across the Pacific. Japanese commanders had prepared for everything, except an enemy that would change the rules of war itself. Standing in the ruins of Kwajalein Atoll, surrounded by the debris of obsolete defensive thinking, Rear Admiral Akiyama had witnessed something that military historians would later recognize as a turning point in human conflict. The age of fortress warfare was ending. The age of maneuver warfare, information warfare, and strategic flexibility had begun. The Americans hadn't just shocked Japanese commanders with their island-hopping strategy. They had shocked the world into a new understanding of what warfare could become when intelligence, innovation, and audacity combined to make the impossible inevitable. Are you prepared for the next strategic revolution? Subscribe now and discover the military innovations that continue to reshape our world. Because understanding how the rules changed yesterday might just save your future tomorrow.